Remember when the Queen's Secretary Martin Charteris directed our Governor General towards a Canadian guy who encouraged him to sack Gough Whitlam? Remember when Prince Charles let John Kerr break cabinet confidentiality to him in Papua New Guinea, and then said Kerr was right to sack Whitlam? So somehow I've ended up on Team Harry and Meghan. Didn't see that one coming in life. Now, before the Aussie comrades get in, I want to make it clear. Everything I say about the royals is somewhat tongue-in-cheek. We're not just looking at the Crown today, we're also looking at the CIA, and in my opinion, because of their intervention, there was no stopping Whitlam from being fired. If you're new to the channel here, I'd recommend watching our most recent video on Gough Whitlam's government. It's the latest in an entire chronological series on the history of Australian politics. And we left the end of last episode with Liberal opposition leader Malcolm Fraser using his Senate majority to block Gough Whitlam's supply bill after Labor MPs Rex Connor and Jim Cairns misled Parliament about getting a foreign loan. When Fraser did this triggered what was called the constitutional crisis, where each party actively controlled one house each, making it impossible for Whitlam to govern. Now, Americans, I know that's normal for you, but we like to have parties that can govern. Oh, sorry, that was very patronising. Actually, no, you got rid of our Prime Minister. I rescind my apology and retain my right to be condescending. So this finally allows John Kerr to enter centre stage. Typically, the Governor General is just a ceremonial role. In the Whitlam CIA podcast, link in the description, I described it as being akin to the school captain, a symbolic representative. But imagine if your school code of conduct had a clause where if the principal and the teachers didn't get along, the school captain had the power to sack the principal. It would still be absolutely absurd if they went ahead and did it. Now, by all accounts, John Kerr had a very high view of himself and a great sense of self-importance, often reminding Whitlam that he had the power to sack him. If you didn't already know, Whitlam actually appointed Kerr and also had the power to sack Kerr. The fact that he didn't showed how confident Whitlam was that Kerr wouldn't dare go and sack him. But on November the 11th, 1975, Gough Whitlam went to meet with Kerr, planning on proposing a half-Senate election. The theory was that even Liberal voters would vote majority Labor to see a functional government. Much to his shock, when Whitlam arrived at Kerr's office, Malcolm Fraser was already there, and John Kerr then went and gave Whitlam a letter. The letter basically said, "You're fired effective immediately," and Malcolm Fraser is now the caretaker Prime Minister until elections are held. But there was more to the controversy than just that. With Fraser now as Prime Minister, his supply bill went to the Senate on the same day, and the Labor senators unanimously supported it. The reason why was that they thought it was actually Whitlam's supply bill that was put to them. They hadn't been told yet. On top of that, while Kerr was meeting with Whitlam, the lower house passed several motions of confidence in Whitlam. The Speaker, Gordon Scholes, wanted to pass this on to Kerr to pass to the Queen, but Kerr refused to meet with Scholes until after he'd sacked Whitlam. Eventually, Scholes went straight to the Queen, who said it was improper for the Queen to interfere in such matters. A month later, Australia went to the polls and Fraser smashed Whitlam in both houses. In 1977, Whitlam challenged Fraser once more, but lost again before resigning. So, where does the CIA come into things? So, to get an even broader picture, you can check out our podcast on Whitlam and the CIA, and we also did one on Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq this week. If we get 30 Spotify ratings, I'll make the top commented person on this video into an imposter for the next video.
Now that you said that, it's probably going to be like, I don't know, Tracy Grimshaw or Joby Peters' wife.
Well, I have already used Tracy Grimshaw, so you guys are in a lot of power here. Now, let's think back to last week. What motives would the CIA have to depose Whitlam? Well, there were a couple. Firstly, he was critical of Nixon and Kissinger's Christmas bombings in North Vietnam, and was actually frozen out by the US as a result. Secondly, under Rex Connor, Whitlam's Labor government had made a move to nationalise its resources, mainly the mines, which would greatly affect US mineral companies who were making huge profits off of digging up and selling Australian minerals. Thirdly, Whitlam's Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, had raided ASIO, who was sharing intelligence with the CIA. But perhaps most importantly, the lease for America's spy base in Australia, Pine Gap, was up for renewal. And Whitlam was giving mixed messages as to whether America would get that lease. But anyone who did Year 11 legal studies would know that motive isn't proof. And so the question I'm sure you're asking is, where's the evidence for this? Well, we're going to start with this guy, Christopher Boyce. There was actually a movie made about him in 1985 called The Falcon and the Snowman. Basically, he sold intelligence secrets to the Soviet Union and smuggled intel into their embassy in Mexico. Now, Boyce makes a few accusations about his time in intelligence. Firstly, as a satellite contractor for Pine Gap, he argues that his security director, Rick Smith, told him not to share all of the information coming from Pine Gap with Australia, which actually went against the terms of the lease. In an SBS interview, he said that the Americans viewed Whitlam as an Australian Ho Chi Minh, and the CIA chief at TWR, the satellite company that Boyce worked for, called John Kerr our man Kerr. Now, you may be thinking that his testimony is invalid because he sold secrets, but according to Boyce, America's treatment of Whitlam is what actually caused him to become disillusioned with the CIA, and any mention of Australia at his trial was swiftly objected to by the opposition. Secondly, in 1977, Jimmy Carter sent his Assistant Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, to meet with Whitlam at the Qantas Lounge in Sydney's airport. The message given was that America would never again interfere in Australian politics or elections. Obviously, the emphasis is on the word again here, inferring that it did happen before. People will often say that that's a lot to be taken from one word, but why would the president send his Assistant Secretary of State to visit a guy who's not the Prime Minister anymore if it was just for a blanket announcement? Thirdly, according to Whitlam's Minister for Labour, Clyde Cameron, and you can find all this in John Pilger's Guardian article from 2014, MI6 was bugging their officers. Then later in the Pilger article, he argued that in the 1980s, senior CIA officials had revealed to him that the heads of MI6 and the CIA met to discuss the Whitlam issue with urgency, and that a deputy CIA director said that Kerr had done what he was told to do. On that, according to Clyde Cameron, when he floated the idea of nationalising its resources to US Ambassador to Australia Marshall Green, apparently Green just said, well, we'd move in. It's also worth noting that Green was often referred to as the coup master as he was placed in Indonesia just weeks before the US-backed Suharto overthrew Sukarno. But there's still more. According to the Australian Independent Media Network, the CIA laundered $24 million into the Liberal Party, Country Party, and other pro-US politicians in the 1975 election that came after Whitlam was sacked. Frank Nugan was an Australian lawyer, and Michael Hand was a New Yorker with a CIA background who had previously helped the CIA in doing arms deals in Angola. In 1980, the bank collapsed after Frank Nugan's apparent suicide, in which Michael Hand fled the country dressed up as a butcher, first to Fiji, then to Vancouver, then to New York, where he vanished for decades, until being found by 60 Minutes in 2015. I'll have way more to say on this one though on a future podcast. So, no, you didn't actually miss this episode of The Crown. Now, I want to make it clear that the focus of this isn't actually going to be on Queen Elizabeth herself, but more so on her private secretary Martin Charteris, and of course the now King, Charles III. If we remember back to last week, Whitlam was making moves away from the monarchy by scrapping God Save the Queen as the national anthem, and by replacing the knighthood with the Order of Australia. Now, one of the things we need to recognise about John Kerr was that he was considering exercising a power that had never been used by any of his predecessors, and one that many viewed as an extinct power. As a result, he was looking for constant validation, and in fairness to the royals, he went to them rather than them consistently going to him. Now, if you don't know the backstory, basically a historian by the name of Jenny Hocking sought access to John Kerr's letters because according to Australian law, government documents become accessible after 30 years. However, the National Archives opposed this on the basis that they were personal rather than government documents. The case went to the High Court, and eventually the court ruled that Kerr's letters to the palace were government documents and ought to be made public. So we'll start with Prince Charles. So in letters between Kerr and the Queen's Secretary Martin Charteris in October of 1975, Kerr recounts his experience with Charles back in September while the two were in Papua New Guinea for their Independence Day. Following me so far? Well, in this encounter, Kerr said that he told Charles that he was weighing up sacking Whitlam before Whitlam sacked him. This is before supply even gets blocked, and apparently Charles's response was that the Queen should not have to accept Whitlam's advice that Kerr be recalled from his Governor-General duties. Not only that, but in letters between Kerr and Charles from March the following year, Charles said to Kerr that what he did was the right and courageous thing to do. So much for political neutrality. And you can break neutrality by liking this video and letting me know below, coup or not. The really other alarming thing was that Charteris himself intervened. As Kerr was weighing up the decision and frequently breaching cabinet confidentiality to the Crown, Charteris pointed him in the direction of a Canadian constitutional expert called Eugene Fawzi. You might be thinking, well, what help would a Canadian be in a situation like this? Well, as part of the Commonwealth, his shtick was in interpreting how British common law and royal powers manifested themselves in Commonwealth countries. And so Fawzi was actually a big advocate of firing Whitlam because he couldn't get supply through the Senate. Now, that was all very well and good, but there was one slight issue. He made no mention of Section 13 of the Constitution, which allows for the half-Senate election that Whitlam was after as a way of resolving a gridlocked parliament. So, not only did Charteris breach neutrality by giving Kerr legal advice, it was incomplete advice that completely skewed Kerr towards rejecting Whitlam's proposal. And so, if I've sold you on both the CIA theory and the fact that the Crown was not exactly neutral, then I do want to point out that the Crown was still much more benevolent than the CIA. Quite simply, when given the opportunity to weigh in, Charles used it to nudge Kerr towards removing someone who was taking Australia away from the Crown. The CIA had much more skin in the game, and for me, a much more sinister cartel to worry about. And you can learn more about them by clicking here next week when we look at the CIA turning on its own informant, the de facto leader of Panama, Manuel Noriega. If you want something lighter, can you name a single of Gerald Ford's policies? If not, click on this video here to understand the government of the president who nearly had identical circumstances to Biden.